Hello, everyone. It's about 5 minutes until the start time. I just want to put out a warning to folks that I am located in the New Jersey area and we are currently having a severe thunderstorm. So hopefully I will not lose internet. So we had some flickering lights, but just as a warning in case I drop out, people know why I drop out or if if something happens. But hopefully if all things go well, we'll start in about 5 minutes. We'll probably start a minute or two after the actual start time. But in case you do have any questions, please feel free to post those questions in the questionnaires box, and we'll do our best to answer those questions as we go throughout the session. Or if not, we can try to do it at the end of the session. But so we'll start again in about 4 to 5 minutes. Thanks. Hello, everyone. It's about 2 minutes until the start time. Just as a reminder to folks that we will start about a minute or two after the actual start time. If you do have any questions, please feel free to post any of those questions on the questionnaires box. Just as an update to folks as well, I am in a location where there's a severe thunderstorm going on right now, so it's a potential of me losing internet. Right now, it might be dying out, but hopefully it won't. But if I end up dropping out for some reason, you know why. So again, we'll start in about 3 to 4 minutes. Thanks. Hello, everyone. It is 1 p.m. Eastern. This is the official start time. However, we will be waiting for another 2 minutes just to give people time to connect and get on. Just as a quick reminder to folks, if you have any questions, please feel free to post those questions on the questionnaires toolbox that's available to you, and we'll do our best to answer the question either during the session or after the session. Also, just as a warning to folks too, that again, I do have a severe thunderstorm currently going on in my area, which could potentially cause internet outages. So if I do drop off, that is the reason why it is, and I will do my best to get back on in some way. So again, we'll start in 2 minutes. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last session of the DMARC Bootcamp. Again, my name is Shahzad Mirza. I'm the Director of Operations for Global Cyber Alliance. So what we're going to do in this session here is there's going to be 2 parts to it. So the first part is just going to do a quick review of everything that we talked about over these past few weeks. So just some of the key items that you need to remember and you need to focus on when it comes to DMARC and doing the DMARC implementations. So that's what we talk about in the first part. And then the second part of it, we're going to talk about some other additional email security mechanisms that you really should take a look at and take into consideration of doing and implementing within your environment to have a better security in-depth strategy when it comes to email. And again, we're going to focus mainly on the server side aspect of it. So first thing here is obviously we're talking about key items. So remember, right, what DMARC is all about and what DMARC is actually doing for you. Okay, it's going to be a way to make sure that you have a way to have an identity check for your domain name, right? To make sure that only authorized people and authorized users are using your systems, your domain names, right? And it's not something that's being used for fraudulent purposes, right? So over the past few weeks, we talked about the different components to DMARC. We went through the authentication, we went through the reporting, and we went through the conformance. And I'll quickly review those again in these few slides. But remember, what is the major benefits of doing DMARC and implementing DMARC, right? Because you are protecting your brand, you're protecting the integrity and the trust of your brand, right? So you're preventing it from being used for fraudulent type of activity, you know, and whether it's going to your business partners, or whether it's going to your citizens, or whether it's going to your consumers, right? Because you want to make sure that your message is actually getting across the way it's supposed to go and how it was supposed to go through. Right, but then remember where DMARC is actually implemented as well, the other benefits to it, that on the consumer side, so the Google, so like Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo, and so on, these consumer-based email service providers are using DMARC verification to make sure that their consumers are protected. Right, so remember, this is the verification, not the policy side. Some of those email consumer sites are looking and seeing what they can do with the policy side of the house, but they have a lot to deal with when it comes to that. But I mean, more than 80% actually of the current total number of worldwide email accounts are actually protected by using DMARC and using the DMARC verification. So it's up to the organization now to do their part and put in the DMARC policy. So remember, this is something that you have to create, right? That's something you own the domain, you're responsible for that domain, so therefore you have to create the entries and the policy in your DNS. Remember too, it also can improve on deliverability, right? Because this is a marketing aspect of it, right? Your messages are actually going to get delivered to the inbox, right? They're not, hopefully they won't get stuck at other spam filters or other filters that will prevent it from getting to the inbox, right? So by implementing a DMARC policy at an enforcement level, right? Not at the lowest level. And at enforcement level, it'll improve the deliverability of those messages. And in most cases, we've seen places say anywhere between like 10 to 25% increase in deliverability, right? And remember that there are some of these consumer side email-based providers will actually block your messages if they see that your email reputation is poor, right? Because there are people using your domain and sending out spam using your domain. So if people are continuously report it and then they see the number of traffic being high from these messages from unauthorized locations, they're going to start blocking your messages, right? Google has been known to do that. And the only way you can get it back and be able to send it to Gmail users and any G Suite users is to actually implement DMARC at a reject or quarantine level, right? We've seen that for a hospital, we've seen that for a retail store, and we've seen that for another large organization as well. So they had to do that in order to get back into it. And the reason we know it is because they try to contact us asking for help with DMARC, but they couldn't contact us using their work email. They actually had to use a Hotmail or Gmail account, their personal accounts, to actually contact us to get that set up correctly. And the other aspect is visibility. Remember when I keep stressing about reports, I kept stressing it each week. Reports, reports, reports. Those reports are critical because those reports are going to tell you what to do, what needs to be done, and who's using your domain name. So those important reports are going to be very critical and very important. But remember what DMARC specifically is protecting against, right? It's protecting against domain spoofing. It's not protecting against those other types of domains like lookalike domains or lookalike cousin domains. It's only going to protect the domain that you're applying the policy to. So if you own those lookalike domains or those cousin type domains, apply a DMARC policy to it so that way you're protecting those as well. But you have to own the domain in order to apply a DMARC policy onto it. And remember what you're creating the policy for as well. You're going to do it for all public domains that you own, whether they're used for email or not. Right? Because if you remember last week when I talked about the reporting aspect, again, I talked about the part where you need to put in those reject policies for those domains. We put you an empty SPF policy and a DMARC policy of reject to those domains. Right? So that way you're protecting those and no one can use those domains until you say otherwise and within your policies. So those are the things you need to take into account. Remember, apply it to all your public domains, whether they're used for email or not. So remember how all DMARC works as a whole, right? Because you're going to be creating and publishing those records in DNS, right? You're creating TXT records for DMARC, right? For SPF, you're also creating TXT records. For DKIM, you're creating a CNAME or a TXT record, right? So those are the kinds of things you're doing, but this is all things that you're doing on your DNS system, right? The sender, this is completely transparent to the sender because everything is happening on the server side. So all these things are happening on the server side where that's the metadata is being added, the DKIM signing is being occurring here, the start of the pathways in terms of where the envelope from and the recipient from is being put in here, right? And you're sending that email off to the recipient server. Remember, the second part to this is that the sending organization creates the policy, the receiving side creates or enables the DMARC verification on their email security gateway or whatever system that they have that can actually check for incoming messages for DMARC. So that has to be enabled in order to do those checks. And it's going to check with the sending organization's DNS server to see what the policy is, what needs to be implemented, what are the records and things like that. Right, and then depending on your policy, that's what they will typically follow, right? So your policy levels, remember the 3 levels are none, quarantine, and reject. None, you always start off with none. Why? Because that's your monitored only mode. That's the mode you're going to go through and review those reports and make sure that your SPF and DKIM, those settings are all correct. And then you can move up to quarantine and then ultimately move up to reject, right? Because if at quarantine, if those checks fail, if all those checks fail, messages are going to go to spam and junk folder. Whereas a reject, those messages won't be delivered in any way. But then also remember where the reports are coming from, right? The reports are coming back from the recipient email servers. Right? They're the ones who are reporting back to you. That's assuming they have DMARC verification enabled. If they don't, then then obviously they're not going to get a report for them. If they do, you should get a report. But again, remember, not all of these people, send reports back. right? There are organizations like Microsoft, Proofpoint, and a few others that don't send aggregate reports. Majority of them actually don't send RUF reports. So like Google, Microsoft, Proofpoint, and all the big vendors, and Yahoo, and so on, they do not send you the DMARC report, the forensic reports. Okay, so you may not get some of those reports, and you may not get some of that information. Now remember, you're also creating a TXT record, right? The host name for this DNS record has to always start with _DMARC, right? If you leave out the underscore, it's not going to work. If you misspell DMARC, it's not going to work. It should be lowercase as well. So _DMARC in lowercase. It needs to be lowercase. So that way it's recognized. That's what the people who have DMARC verification enabled, that's what they're looking for to follow your DMARC policy. Right? And remember, you don't need to have all the tags for the policy, right? The ones you really need, you should start off with at least V equals DMARC1 semicolon, right? That's required. That needs to be the first tag you use. P equals, then your policy level, semicolon. That's the second tag. That's the one that needs to be put in second. Then after that, you put in whichever tags you're going to be using. But the RUA tag, again, we're saying at GCA standpoint, we're saying it's required. It's actually optional, but there's no point in putting in V equals DMARC1 semicolon P equals none semicolon and not getting those reports, especially if it's for one that's actively being used for email, right? Because the ultimate goal is that you want to get those reports and review those reports and make adjustments accordingly. So you need to have at least the RUA tag to get that information, to get those aggregate reports. But remember, the other one to take into consideration is the SP tag, right? For your subdomains, right? Because the P tag applies to your top level and to your subdomains. So if you actually have subdomains that are being used for email on the top level domain policy, you want to put in SP equals none. So that way, when you change your top level tag to quarantine or reject, your sub level domains aren't being impacted, right? Or it could be the other way. It could also be where if you do not have subdomains, then put in SP equals reject. So that way you're protecting all your subdomains. You don't have to put in a policy for every single subdomain or public subdomain if you don't want to. You can, doesn't hurt to do that, but you don't have to if you have that SP equals reject. Remember, this policy, top level policy applies to the domain you're applying it to, plus everything that's underneath it in terms of subdomains. Now also remember, when it comes to proper implementation, right, you do need to have SPF and/or DKIM set up, right? Our recommendation is really to do your best to have both. Have the authorized systems in your SPF, right, the ones that are allowed to send mail on your behalf, right? So your own mail servers, your third-party vendors and such, and then DKIM, right? Especially if it's a third-party cloud provider, have DKIM set up. Right, DKIM typically ends up being the one you can set up and the one that always stays the same, meaning that you typically don't have issues with DKIM signing too often, unless the third party has a new server set up. But otherwise, typically we don't see too many issues with DKIM. We see more issues ending up with actually having SPF set up correctly, where it may not use your domain name, right? So, but remember, when it comes to DMARC, one of the two needs to pass, right? Both of them don't have to pass, right? So SPF, in terms of verification and alignment, as long as those pass, you're good. If DKIM fails, you're fine, right? But if all of DKIM passes and SPF fails, you're still fine. But if all of SPF and all of DKIM fails, so that includes the alignment, then DMARC is going to consider that a fail. All right, so remember that and take that into consideration. So when it comes to SPF, right, you should be using either -all or ~all. Really, you should use the -all, right? I mean, it's better to use a hard fail than a soft fail, because the soft fail, remember that you're not saying that it necessarily is bad, but it could be authorized. You're not really making a good judgment call on there. But there are going to be cases where you may have to use ~all, and that typically ends up being with the third-party vendors that you may be using. And remember, you can only have one SPF record per domain, right? So if your top level domain is set up for SPF, you can't have two, 3, or 4. You can only have one, and that's the one that's going to be used. You can do nesting, that's different. But again, it's just SPF, V equals SPF1 and so on that you're going to have. for your records. And then each subdomain that's being used for email, they're going to have their own SPF record. And remember, there's things that you have to take into account, like the 10 domain lookup issue. So you can do things like flattening or dynamic or instant SPF. So flattening meaning that all the domains are converted to IP addresses, right? Not the best thing to do, because if you don't have control over those IPs, you can run into issues. Whereas dynamic is where you're using a third party to handle the SPF record for you. And then alignment versus verification. Remember, because there's two different parts to that, right? Verification is just saying that, does the SPF domain match? Here's the SPF domain that's being used in the message. Is that correct? You know, is the IP address for that correct? But then alignment is defining what it's actually checking against, right? So alignment is checking the return path with the from header. So as long as those match, the alignment is correct, right? Whereas when it's checking for SPF, which is the received SPF, this passes, this could end up passing because this domain is checking this domain for this IP address. So it's going to check this domain's SPF record to see if this IP address is valid or not. So that's where verification happens. So like the second one, this is showing you, see if you see here, it shows it's from Global Cyber Alliance, but the return path is a different domain. But if you look at received SPF, it says pass. So why is it passing? Because this domain is what it looked up for. It looked SPF up for. And this domain and this IP address are correct, right? Because if you look up the SPF for this domain, this is the IP address that will pop up. But DMARC fails because the domain is not aligned. All right, so this is one of the things you have to look for when it comes to those reports. Right, so that's one of the things you have to look for. So the domain alignment needs to be the same, right? Same. So for DKIM, remember DKIM is doing PKI, right? There's a private key and a public key. So if you're responsible for this the private public keys, make sure you're protecting those private keys, right? The private key has to be on the email server, right? Because that's the server that's being used to sign, or it has to be on your email gateway. Wherever the signing is occurring, that's where the private key needs to exist. But make sure it's secure, right? Make sure it's not make sure it doesn't have that and everyone has access to it, right? Only it needs to be restricted to the system, and then potentially admin access in case you have to get to it, right? And then that's the public key that you're publishing in DNS, right? But also remember, that's in the case of the TXT, if you're publishing the public key. If you're using a CNAME record, then the third-party vendor is the one who's going to provide you with what the record is going to be. So they tell you create this CNAME record or create a TXT record. Most commonly, when it comes to cloud service providers, it's a CNAME. But there have been cases where TXT, like Microsoft Office 365 uses CNAMEs, Google G Suite actually uses TXT. So they actually they give you the public key, right? And it's especially key to use this if you're using cloud service providers, okay? It's not only if you're using cloud. So use it if you have cloud service, make sure that you have this, but use it alongside with your own systems as well. And you can have more than one DKIM record. I mean, the expectation is if you have multiple systems, you should have multiple DKIM records, right? And also remember, again, when it comes to alignment, DKIM is the same thing when it comes to alignment. You need to make sure the domain aligns, right? Because when DMARC does the verification, if it just when DKIM does verification, it just checks for the DKIM portion, right? So DKIM is just going to say, okay, well, the signature, the domain in here is for mcsignup.com. Okay, let's look up mcsignup.com. Let's see if what they have. Oh, okay, they have a DKIM record. Okay, everything looks fine. Okay, it matches, so therefore it passes. But the problem is again, DMARC is going to say, no, this is failing. Why? Because the domain in the message header for DKIM does not match the from address domain. So since these are different, that's a fail unaligned, right? So this is why it's important when especially with third-party vendors, follow their directions, right? Because they're not going to have you just create a DKIM key or publish the DKIM record of whether CNAME or TXT. They need you to come back to their portals and click on things like enable or verify authentication, because they need to check to make sure you have it. And once you do that, then that enables the signing capability. So now your messages will actually start being signed with the appropriate information and the appropriate private key. So make sure it's key with DKIM and even with SPF. Check to see what your third-party providers tell you to do and follow directions and follow suit. Remember, in terms of DNS, right? So DMARC, only one record per domain, right? So if you have subdomains that are used for email, put in a separate DMARC policy for each one of those subdomains that are used for email. SPF, again, also one record per domain. But remember the other aspect of it when it comes to the host name, right? For SPF, there's no host name, it's blank. So depending on what system you're using, either they'll tell you to put an @ symbol, put a null, or just leave it blank, right? On Windows, you just leave it blank. On Linux and Bind, you put the @ symbol there, or you can just leave it completely blank as well. In some cloud service providers, you may have to put an @ symbol in there. DKIM, you can have multiple records, but remember what the record name starts with. It's always the selector name. So either you created what the selector name is, or you're defining, or the third-party vendor is defining to you what the selector name is. But then _ domain key, and then if necessary, the rest of the fully qualified domain name. And also remember when you're using bind, check for that $ origin, right? And then your domain. Because remember, if you put it there, you don't need to put in the fully qualified domain name after the name of the record. You just put the name of the record and leave the rest of it after that, because it automatically appends the domain name. If you add that your fully qualified domain name, you basically put it in twice, right? And on Linux, remember, it requires for DMARC and for DMARC and DKIM, you need to have the double quotes. Really, for best practice, so SPF, you might use the double quotes as well. And then for all DNS, just remember, they will tell you whether you need the fully qualified domain names or not. They will tell you whether you need the quotation marks or not. If you leave out the quotation marks, in most cases, it'll automatically put them in for you. So just keep an eye out for these kinds of things. So DMARC reports, remember there's two types of reports that we're talking about here, right? So there's aggregate reports and forensic reports, right? Majority of providers out there will send you the aggregate reports, and that's the one you definitely want to get, right? Because that's the one that's going to have the IP address of the system that's sending email using your domain. It'll tell you how many messages are being sent from that domain, and it'll tell you what's going on with SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, right? It'll tell you what policy is being applied. It will tell you if there's an override. It'll tell you if SPF is passing and failed unaligned, or if it's aligned. Same thing with DKIM. It'll tell you all that information. That's why you want to get those aggregate reports. The forensic reports, you may or may not get those. Most likely not going to get those, because the majority of vendors don't actually send those reports. And the reason why, again, it was that privacy issue that we talked about last week, right? Because this actually contains the message of the body. It contains the full message headers, it contains the body, it can contain potentially attachments. So there's a lot of privacy issues and concerns around that. So that's the thing you have to take a look at, and things that you have to take into consideration when it comes to RUF. So when you put in their RUF equals mail to, send it only to someone within your organization. Don't send it out to external organizations. All right, aggregate reports, that's up to you. Either, if you're using a third-party vendor, send it to them. You shouldn't there's no privacy issues in that. So forensic reports, send it to yourself. Now remember that aggregate reports are sent in XML format, and you can send it to whatever email address is internal to your organization. You can send to external ones, but remember that you had to do those extra steps in order to send those out. But send it to a generic email account within your organization, because you could potentially get a large number of reports, right? Especially with aggregate, potentially forensic reports as well. Send it to like a DMARC @ or a DMARC-RUA, DMARC-RUF if you want to separate them out. Do it in those sense, because remember, these records are also public. So you don't want to put your personal work email address out there in the public, and then somebody can potentially find it and then use it to spam you. But the reports, the reason, again, I'm stressing the reports so much is that these reports are what are going to help you determine to get to an enforcement level policy, right? Because you need to get to quarantine or reject. Having your policy set to none is not doing anything for you, except you're getting inundated with a bunch of reports. You need to review those reports. You need to go through and check your SPF, check your DKIM, see which ones are legitimate, and make the adjustments that you need to make, and then that way you can make your way up to reject. And then now you're actually doing something with it, your policy. How long will it take? Again, it depends on your organization size, right? Some organizations I've seen that are doing in about a week or less, but some larger organizations, it could potentially take you 6 months to a year, depending on how many domains you have. And that's typically the situation where people have multiple domains that it takes the most time to go through and do that. So remember, what is next, right? You get to review those reports. Once you put that policy of none, review those reports, adjust SPF, add DKIM records as needed, if needed. And then when you're ready for it, move up to quarantine and reject, right? You don't have to review the reports as much as you did when you were at none, but it doesn't hurt to keep getting those so that we can take a look at them if you had to, when, if in terms of email not being received or certain things were going on, you have reports to look at to see and potentially get an answer as to what may be going on, right? And whenever you have new mail services, remember, before those mail services get used, create those add to your SPF and then create the DKIM keys if there's our DKIM keys at that point. All right. Remember also to save you time, all those public domains not used for email, do those first. Put in that policy of reject, put in that blank SPF policy. So that way those are at least protected and you can focus on the ones that you need to focus on for email. So at least you don't get a bunch of reports based on those other domains, or get calls and things like that about those other domains. And then do consider using other security mechanisms, right? And that's what we're going to talk about in these next few slides, right? Because we talked about SPF, we talked about DKIM, and we talked about DMARC, but then there's other ones that I briefly mentioned in the past presentations, which were ARC and BIMI. So these are two that I'm sure most of you are interested in. So let's do ARC first. So ARC stands for Authenticated Received Chain. What does ARC do for organizations, right? The idea is that when messages go through certain systems, each system they go through, the message is being modified, right? The message header is being modified, right? For SPF, right? The sending system is now changing. Now, where does that mainly happen with? This mainly happens on with systems that are mail forwarders or systems that are part of mailing lists, right? Because what happens on a mail forwarder, they're forwarding messages off to the appropriate people. So there's a change there, right? Because now the new server that's sending the message is somebody else, not the originating system. For mailing lists, right? You send an email to the mailing list, and now the mailing list is the one who's sending the messages out to everybody. So now you're breaking authentication at that point, right? So it's not just DMARC that's being broken, but it's SPF and it could potentially be DKIM that's being broken, right? So all your authentication mechanisms are being broken, and this is why they created ARC, because what ARC is going to do is going to preserve the original email authentication as it goes through these hops. Then those hops that modify these messages. So but it preserves the original one. So that way when the message headers are being checked, it can look at the actual originating system and say, okay, this is what we're actually checking against. Right? So people are using this, Google is using this, Yahoo is using this, right? Because when people did Yahoo and those that started using DMARC, their Yahoo groups and Google groups started to break. So they implemented ARC to do that. Now, does everybody have to do ARC? No. You don't. It's only organizations that do mail forwarding and mailing lists. Those are the organizations that need to implement ARC. Nobody else needs to implement ARC. Okay, so this will be people like who are doing those mail list servers that have those group type settings when it comes to messages, right? I mean, some university systems do something like that, right? They'll have mailing lists for some of the classes. There are also systems, some organizations will have mail forwarders, so they forward mail to the appropriate locations. Those are the things that you'll need to have ARC implemented. So ARC is not something that's required for everybody, okay? And there is one tool called OpenARC that's available on GitHub. It's an open source tool that you can actually use on your systems. If you're dealing with things like mail forwarders or mail list servers. Then there's BIMI, and a lot of people have probably heard about this, Brand Indicators for Message Authentication. And so what this is basically doing is it's adding another layer of, in essence, authentication. It's using images. So what you may have been noticing if when you have like your Gmail accounts or Yahoo accounts, that there's a little, now for whenever you get those messages in your inbox, you see these little letters like an S or an M or something like that. Typically ends up being the first initial, or it might be the initials of the sender. In some cases, you see an image in there. So you can even like the image of the brand, right? You know, so if you're getting something from like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of one that actually works. But I mean, it could be from like, I don't know, like Under Armour or from Nike or someone like that. You'll see their actual logo as the indicator there. That's what this brand indicator for message, the BIMI is trying to do. It's trying to put that a valid logo that's authorized from that source or from that organization to say that, look, as long as it matches these checks and that image appears, then it's considered a valid. So that way there's something visual that's available to the end user to be able to see. Now, in order for BIMI to work, you do have to have a DMARC policy of reject or quarantine, right? That's a requirement. If you're at DMARC at none, BIMI is not going to work. It has to be at reject or quarantine. This is also primarily right now, I've seen that it's because it's still in a working stages. So you can use it, you can implement it, but you may not see a results of it right away. Typically, I've seen this with results happen with people who are large marketing firms and do large amount of marketing. So if you just send like one newsletter a month, that you may not see something like this happen. But if you're something like a retail store or a large marketing firm that does things like this, that's where you're going to probably see it. Right, so you can do this right now. Like the Global Cyber Alliance, we have this implemented, we have this set up. We're waiting for it to be accepted and enabled, but we've had this on for quite a while now. But all you have to do is go in, create a host name called default.bimi, ._bimi. So it's a text record you're creating with the value of v equals bimi1, semicolon, l equals, and then the location of the image file that you're using to represent your organization. Right, so that image file must be an SVG file. It must be on a valid website, a website that you own with a valid SSL certificate that is for your organization. Okay, that's what it's supposed to, if you have those in, that's what's supposed to help against those impersonations, right? There is still a lot of, like I said, there's still a lot of work because what if somebody were to use a different image, not the exact image, but a different image? Yes, those are things that are still being worked out. Right, and those things like certificate authorities and such are coming into play, but it has to be on a valid SSL certificate website, right? It can't be just on a website with an invalid certificate or your own user. It has to be something that has to be completely valid. And so in those aspects, so that's what it's using that SSL certificate as well to do the appropriate authentication, appropriate things. So to look for more information, you can go to these two sites. There's bimigroup.org and bimi.agari.com. They actually have wizards there as well where you can put in the information and it'll spit out to the records that you need to create. And it'll give you more information about BIMI and how to set it up. So those are two, so ARC and BIMI. So ARC, you only need it if you're doing things like mail forwarding and mailing lists. BIMI, yes, this one I do recommend that you do it, you do implement it and put it in place. You may not see the results right away, but when it's actually truly turned on and enabled, you're already set and you're ready to go. You don't have to worry about it. Now some other ones. Now these are outside of DMARC, the DMARC realm, meaning so you don't have to have DMARC or have anything to do with DMARC in order to do these next few that I'm going to be talking about. One is DANE, so DANE for SMTP. So that's DANE stands for DNS-based authentication of named entities. So now DANE can actually be used for various things, right? And it's the idea behind this aspect of using DANE is to protect and make sure that your TLS connections are actually fully encrypted, right? Because there's some issues that in terms of star TLS in which you can actually have people intercept and have man in the middle attacks where it can cause potential issues and interception of information and traffic. This is supposed to add another layer of authentication to it and another layer of that encryption, so it's a little bit more secure. So you have a level of authentication that you're implementing in here by using DNS. Right now, in order for DANE for SMTP to work, you do have to have DNSSEC in place. So domain name system security extensions, that's required in order for DANE to work, right? Because that's what it's using for that second source of verification, right? Because when you implement DNSSEC, you have certain certificates in place, you have information from your registrar that you're putting in place. So now you're creating a little bit more of a secure connection. Okay, so DNSSEC is required, and I'm sure most of you, I know when it comes to certain areas and certain countries, DNSSEC is frowned upon and not highly looked into, but it's something that's an option to you that you can be using, especially if you're already using DNSSEC. You can always put in this as another additional layer of authentication in terms of communications. But things to consider is that, does your registrar support DNSSEC? Right, because the information that you need in order to put in DNSSEC and enable DNSSEC for your domain, you need to get that from the registrar. They're the ones who provide you with the DNS records that you need to create, that you would put into your hosting provider or send to your hosting provider, right? And so your registrar could be your hosting provider as well, so whoever you bought the domain from. So you need to check to see, because not all of them support it. Also, if you're using an email cloud service provider, right, because that's who you're going to be relying on for DANE over SMTP. You're relying on a cloud service provider to do that, because right, they're your SMTP provider. So they need to support DNSSEC in order for this to work. And then they are the ones who are going to actually implement DANE. So like for our example on our end, at GCA, we use Google G Suites, right? Google G Suite actually does have DNSSEC mail servers, but they don't support DANE. Microsoft, however, has stated that they are going to be supporting DANE with Office 365. So that is something that is going to be, that they implement, that they're saying they're going to go through the process, and hopefully at some point, if they haven't already, are going to go in and start implementing DANE on their systems. The other one is, which is MTA-STS, that stands for Mail Transfer Agent Strict Transport Security. This actually does the same thing as DANE does. It's just how it does it is different, right? Because it's doing, again, it's saying, you know, it's enabling those services to receive TLS secure SMTP connections. So it's doing that authentication to prevent these man-in-the-middle attacks. But for MTSSEC, it's not using DNSSEC. Instead, what it's actually using is using SSL. And it's using your SSL certificates to actually do the authentication and doing those things. So by doing this, enables the domains to opt into robust transport layer security and securely communicate what their actual MX servers are supposed to be. Because you're going to create DNS records, but you're also creating a separate type of record or a separate type of file on your web services that's actually say, these are the list of our MX servers. So it's a second level confirmation to say that if it's not on this list, then it's not supposed to be considered an authorized system, right? So when you do this, so you have that text file you're creating that lives on that web server. So it has to be your web server. So an authorized system that you have control, a domain you have control, and a web server that you have control over with a valid SSL certificate, right? So it has to have a valid SSL certificate. You can create a DNS text record again. So it's underscore MTA-STS. Then the value is V equals STS V1 semicolon ID equals, and then a string of numbers. So the string of numbers can really be whatever numbers you want. So most cases people will do is they'll put the date with the random numbers afterwards. So in this case, here's 2019-04-23, and then just a random string of numbers. And then what they'll do is they'll just change the date. Because one part of the MTA-STS that's critical is that anytime you change the text file, you have to change the value. And the reason you change the value is so that what other systems that are participating in MTA-STS know that the record has changed, and to use the new records. That way it confirms that it's valid and that there's been changes made. So when you create this .txt file, the location you're going to put it on is the domain MTA, so a subdomain MTA-STS dot, your domain name slash dot well dash known slash, and then the file name is MTA-STS.txt. Now, the other advantage of using MTSSEC is that it actually uses TLS reporting to generate reports. So you'd actually implement TLS-RPT, and then you can get reports to say what's going, how many messages failed and how many messages passed. Now that's the most that it tells you. It doesn't give you a whole lot of detail in terms of what's going on. And MTA-STS is something that's supported by Google. So Google is using that. So if you have Google G Suites, you can actually go through the process of MTA-STS. They have instructions on how to do it and where to put the files and things like that. And they actually have MTA-STS verification tool to make sure that you do have it set up correctly and that it's checking in and doing the testing for you. And the last one is TLS reporting, right? So TLS-RPT. So this is what's going to allow you to monitor those secure transport of email to a domain, right? So MTSSEC uses that, to get that information, but you do again have to create a TXT record. So you see, it's all this stuff. You're actually creating TNS, you're using something you already have that you have to actually implement and create, plus additional steps. So, but for TLS reporting, you just have to create the TXT record. There's nothing really else that you have to really implement. So you're going to create a record called _SMTP._TLS and then your domain name, and then you can provide the other information. So you're putting in V equals TLS. This should actually be RPT, so there's a typo there. So it's TLS-RPT, not PRT. TLS-RPT version 1, semicolon, then RUA, right? Aggregate report, just like DMARC. So RUA equals mail to, and that should be a colon, not a quote. I'll fix this when we push out the slide. So this should be a quote, a semicolon, not double quotes. So mail to quote TLS-RPT at the domain that you're going to send the reports to. So for each one of those, we're sending you the RFC information as well, so that you can look at the RFC and get more technical details and more of the nitty gritty into it, because we didn't really go into that really deep dive into each one of these tool sets. But what we will be doing is on the Bootcamp resources page, we will provide links to certain resources and how to do certain things and how to implement certain each one of these types of things, so that way you can at least have resources and information to get started with. So just as a reminder again, some of the resources that are available to you is you have DMARC.org. So that's the main site, great source of information, a lot of technical information there. You have our GCA site as well. That's a lot of information there. Our YouTube channels where you can actually go in and take a look at different videos. So we do have videos in terms of setting up Office 365 with DMARC, SPF, and DKIM. We have it for MailChimp. We have it for Salesforce. I have to recreate the G Suite one, so that should hopefully be coming out soon. But if you have other ones that people can recommend, obviously, we will be taking a look if there's a free trial for certain ones. We can actually go through and actually set those up. If you have any questions, post any questions that you may have in the community forum. But again, for the bootcamp, we're going to put all of our resources on this page. So if you just go to dmarc.globalcyberalliance.org, right at the top of the page, there's an image on the right that leads right to the bootcamp resources page where everything will be posted. So the videos are posted there. So the recorded sessions are posted there. We have links to other resources and other information that you have. So I'm going to get to the question, but just to wrap up, so some final items, just so because people are asking some of these questions, there will be a survey. You'll probably get the survey on Monday next week. Please help us out by answering the questions in the survey, because we are looking for feedback. For our last bootcamp, we got a lot of valuable feedback that we applied to this one. So please fill those out, and that'll help us make sure we improve on each of these bootcamps as we go along, because we will be having another bootcamp in September. Certification and completion. So yes, as long as you attended all the sessions and you stayed for the session for the full amount of time. So full amount of time for me is 45 minutes or longer. You'll get the certification and completion with a number of hours listed on there. But as an added bonus, if you've implemented DMARC during the bootcamp, we will give you another 3 credits, additional credits on top of that. Okay, so you have until Friday, this Friday, Friday, June 5th, close of business Eastern, so 5 p.m. Eastern. As long as you have DMARC policy of none in place, a valid DMARC policy with reports, we will add another 3 additional points to your certificate of completion. So far, we've seen about 50 domains that actually did do that. So I'll be running those scans again on Friday night. Other things to take into account. So if you're interested in other GCA products or projects, we do have a GCA cybersecurity toolkit, a cybersecurity toolkit for small businesses. We have one for elections. Basically, these toolkits are just taking the current standards and guidelines that are out there and providing actual tools for these areas or these sectors to actually use. So that way they don't get confused with the guidelines, but they know what to do and what tools to actually implement. So if you're interested in it, feel free to ask and reach out to us and ask about questions. Same thing with AID. AID has to do with Internet of Things. So we can go in and actually take a look at it. So IoT, sorry, getting a question confused here. So with AID, it has to do with IoT, where basically we have IoT type information in terms of we're collecting and doing analysis and research along the type of information we're seeing and what kind of vulnerabilities we're seeing along the IoT side. So, I mean, this does conclude this session, but let me go back and answer some questions because we do have time here. So again, if you do have questions, please let us know. Put those questions in here, and this is the time I'm going to do my best to answer as many questions that I can. So let's see. So what happens if you have multiple SPF records? If you have multiple SPF records, so if you have multiple records, that's V equals SPF 1, and then you have that like 3 or 4 times, that can potentially cause issues, because when the DNS record is looked up, it doesn't know which one's the valid one and which one's the right one. So what you need to do is combine those, put them together. All right, so only one SPF record. If you have multiple SPF records, when they do that search, they don't know which one's the right one to take into look. Whatever the first one they hit, that's the one they're going to use. So an example why you might have used the tilde all. The only time I would say that you want to use the tilde all is when you're starting at P equals none. When your policy level is at none, then for SPF, you want to consider using the tilde all, because that's where you want to just go through your SPF records and make sure that things are fine. Sorry, go through those DMARC reports and make sure things are good, things are correct, and things are appropriate. Because when you see things are well and answering correct, then that's where you can now change it to your SPF record to a dash all. But again, remember too, when you have a public domain that's not being used for email, always use the dash all. Don't use the tilde all. So the question is, subdomain configuration for DMARC was mentioned using the SP tag. If you don't intend to send email from a subdomain at all, do you set the subdomain DMARC policy to reject without configuring SPF or DKIM records for those domains? Yes, that is correct. You would put in SP equals reject, and that will now apply the reject policy, reject DMARC policy to all of your subdomains. But just be wary of that, because if you do have subdomains, that reject policy applies to those subdomains that are actually being used for email. So any subdomains that are being used for email, make sure you get that policy in, that DMARC policy in for that subdomain, right? Immediately put in the V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals none, semicolon, RUA equals, mail 2, and so on. Put that in there. So that way, because their subdomain DMARC policy overrides the top level domain policy. So question about certificate, I asked that, so that's there. So what is the most common reason for DKIM setup to fail? Are there variations in the format of the public key? And is there a standard format for DMARC to work? So the common reason I've seen for DKIM setup to fail is primarily when it comes to when you're managing the public key yourself. So meaning where you create the TXT record on your own. So meaning that so what can happen is that your DNS provider may not support the key size that you created, right? If you use 1024 or 2048, right? Because not all DNS providers support 2048. Remember, if you attended the cloud service one that I did a few weeks ago, Google DNS doesn't support 2048. So if you put in a 2048 size key, it doesn't work. I mean, there's ways around it, but if you don't put it in the correct way, DKIM is not going to work. Okay, so you have to take certain things into account, whether they support the 2048 or if they support 1024. In 1024, if it's too long, there's a way to break it, but if you don't break the record correctly, it's not going to work and it's not going to be recognized correctly. That's typically the most common situation, or there might be a spelling error. When like in CNAME, when you create the CNAME record, you put in a spelling error, or you called it underscore domain keys instead of underscore domain key. You know, those are the most typically the most types of things that happen. And there's not really variations in the format of the public key. I mean, by default, it tends to follow the same mechanism. As long as you have the v equals dkim and you have the p equals, those are the two tags that have to be there. Those two tags aren't there, then you're going to run into issues. There are other tags as well that are associated with dkim, but those aren't really required. It's not, you don't have to have those if you don't, you know, it's not going to break anything if you're not using those. So people are asking about me scanning and checking those the DMARC so checking your DMARC for your domains. So in the past I was doing it every Monday, but now this time around I'm going to do it Friday night. So 5 p.m. just after 5 p.m. Eastern, then I'm going to do it. So I mean, technically, if it's as long as I remember to do it, I mean, it's always a possibility that I may end up actually doing it on Monday morning. So I may actually end up doing it on the 8th, in the morning of the 8th. So you may be able to get away with it over the weekend. But just so people know too, I mean, if there's a point in time where if people are interested in doing scanning, so we have our DMARC setup guide where you can put in your domain, and in that domain, you know, you can test it one or two domains in there. But we also have on GitHub. So if in GitHub you go to Global Cyber Alliance, look up Global Cyber Alliance, there we have a DMARC checker, a DMARC scanner that you can actually download, and you can actually use that to check for multiple domains. So it's a tool that I actually use, and that's the tool that I actually do with the scanning of the domains that are out there. And just so people are clear, we don't share these domains with anyone. That strictly stays internal to us. We just give statistics around it, but we never share the actual domain name or anything like that. And you can also always ask us to run scans. So if you want to give us a list of domains to scan for your membership, again, we'll be happy to run that scan for you, and we can obviously share that just with you and not do anything else with it from our end. Let's see. So someone provided us another resource. Thank you. We'll make sure we can put that. We'll put that up, that resource up as well. For dynamic SPF, so info materials. So we don't have any specific type of things for that because most of the vendor groups tend to hold this near and dear to their heart. So they don't tend to share any of that information. So I mean, some vendors that do support provide those capabilities, I can tell you, are ValueMail, on DMARC. I believe it's Power DMARC and Easy DMARC are some that actually provide that those capabilities. So they do that. So you would reach out to them to determine, to ask them how, what they can do for you and how they can do certain things for you as well in that case. So if you come to a company and they have a lengthy SPF record with a lot of IP4 entries and the historical background as to why, what's the best way to audit clean those up? That's a great question. I mean, the only thing you could do is if you don't, you would really have to look up those IP addresses to see if they actually belong or they're within. I mean, best thing is probably to see, are they within the domain? Are those IP within your domain, right? Are those ones that you actually are responsible for? If there's any IP addresses outside of those, you probably want to consider removing them, but then determine, are they actually, are they actually third-party providers, or are they actually owned by somebody else, and then determine what they're used. Unfortunately, there's not a great way to answer that question, especially if a lot of SPF records IPs in there, but you do have to be careful with that because it could be and that's the thing with third-party IPs in there. It could be incorrect or they could be outdated, which ends up being a problem and becoming an issue. in terms of what's going on. Yeah, so people ask about for ARCA reports, how do you look up information for a specific IP address? So I see failures of what looks like to be a Google IP address. I mean, so what I've done is really there are various resources out there that you can use to look up IP addresses. There's sites like IP Void. There's some DNS who has lookups for IP addresses that will give you that information. Really, those are the best bets, especially if you're doing this on your own. That's one of the advantages of using the vendors, right? The vendors will actually look those up for you and provide you with that information rather than you actually doing it and doing all the effort and putting in the work in there. But yeah, I mean, when I started, I wasn't using one of the vendors in any way. I actually would go in and look up using those different IP Void, other IP who has lookups to see who these IP addresses actually belong to. Do Google, Verizon, MS, Yahoo all leverage ARC to make sure they forward emails they receive from orgs with DMARC enforcement policies are not rejected outright? Yeah, majority of the big vendors do. So Verizon owns Yahoo, AOL, so they do support it. Google supports it. I'm not sure if Microsoft supports it yet. I believe they do. And I believe that they have something in place already for it. But yeah, most of the big vendors do actually have that information. So someone asked us, do we have to implement DMARC now for credit? Only if you want the additional credit, right? So, I mean, or if you're shy. So like if you missed one session, you can always get the additional 3 credits so that we can get the certificate. But yeah, that's for extra credit, let's put it that way. Are there any special considerations for Exchange hybrid environments? So where some pieces are on-prem and others are in the cloud with Exchange Online. Yes, there are considerations to take into account. One is that if you don't have an email gateway in place, right? So the assumption is that now you have your Exchange servers, they send out mail, then you have your Office 365, and you're using that as that protection.outlook.com to send out mail. So things you have to take into consideration in that kind of setup. Remember, for Exchange servers, there's no DKIM signing done by default. So you need to install a tool called DKIM Exchange, right? DKIM Exchange is where you're going to install, and that will allow you to create your DKIM keys and do DKIM signing on those Exchange servers. And that's something you have to install on each Exchange server, okay? If you have an email security gateway, then you can add all your mail flows through that. Then you can, most gateways actually have DKIM signing and DKIM key generation capabilities. So you can always do something like that on that side, right? So you can have it set up there. You have your Outlook messages go through there as well. But just remember for the Outlook side, so the Exchange Online side, you need to create the CNAME records for DKIM. You need to put in the SPF, and you need to enable DKIM signing on that side too. So the domain scanning tool, I don't remember the URL offhand, but if you do a search for, if you put in site in Google, if you put in site:/github.com, you should be able to search for Global Cyber Alliance, and the DRS is there, and you can download the tool from there. So there's a suggestion here. So if you want to look up IP addresses, yeah. So Cisco Talos reputation lookup actually has, yeah, they do have a good site as well. So it's talosintelligence.com is a good way, is another good source to use for IP reputation and to look up that, because it'll tell you all that information. Yes, thank you for sharing that. A lot of good resources there, and we'll take note of some of those and make sure that we're sharing the information on there. And there's a lot of good tools out there for SPF checking. All the vendors have SPF checkers in place. For us on our side, we'll just check to see if you have an SPF record and a DMARC record in place. But some other vendors will go further and they'll actually check your SPF records for you in terms of if you reach the 10 domain lookup, and they'll give suggestions in terms of flattening it and such. So those are all the questions that I see. And pretty much got all of them. Again, you are more than welcome to reach out to us for more things. I know there's some things that I had, but you probably have more questions like the exchange hybrid environment. There's probably a little bit more questions along those lines. You're welcome to reach out to us. Remember, just because the boot camp is done doesn't mean that your resources that GCA is going to disappear. We're still here. Email us, contact us, post questions to the community forum, and we'll answer those questions. We'll help guide you through us. We have already had quite a few people reach out to us, and we've been helping them through the process and getting them set up and getting them through what they need to get through. So we'll do what we can and get you as far as we can to get started with, but just realize there may get to a point where we may suggest to use one of the DMARC vendors just for the reporting feature and the reporting capabilities. So we're not going away. GCA is still here. You have my contact information. I will not ignore you. At least try not, unless I'm on PTO. then I may not get to your email right away, but we will do our best. That's why I recommend using our community forum, because you'll have other people other than just us answering questions. So someone just really quick, so to check for DMARC verification, unfortunately, that's not something we can check. You're gonna have to go to your email security provider or gateway and check on there. That's not something that can be manually checked for outside of your organization. Nope. All right, we'll get slides for week 4 up right away. We'll get them. I'll get that passed on. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope we'll get those certificates out soon. You should hopefully see them next week, hopefully by the end of next week, but just give us a little bit of time, just go through and just sort things out. But hopefully within 2 weeks, you should get them. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask us for any questions that you have.